Okay, we're back again for our second installment of the Why series. We're dealing with the questions that all of us struggle with, or all of us have struggled with, or wanted to find answers. And today we're going to talk about why should I believe in God in the first place. Last week we talked about how important it was for us to understand that if we're going to find out why I'm here, I've got to understand where did I come from. And the answer of God is fundamental about finding purpose. So today let's just deal with that. Well, why should I believe in God in the first place? I heard a story once of a little girl who was in Sunday school and she was feverishly drawing a picture. And the Sunday school teacher leaned over and said, "Honey, what are you drawing?" She said, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And she looked at her and said, "Hon, no one knows what God looks like." And the little girl smiled and said, "They will when I'm finished." And so, that's kind of how we are. What does God look like? What is He like? And we, sometimes we just need to get off the busyness and stop and reflect and say, well, why should I believe in God? Is there a God? Which one of the gods? There are a lot of different gods posed out there, and what is He like? So let's begin with that issue. Here's the first thing I think we have to deal with is, why do people seem to struggle with a belief in God's existence? Now, unlike what you may think, because there have been so many high-profile atheists writing best-selling books in the last 4, 5, 6 years, you may think atheism is on the rise, but it really isn't. In fact, a belief in the transcendent and a belief in spirituality and a belief in a deity actually is on the rise in America. Now, it's not always Christian, but yet there is this sense that there is something more. Maybe that's why there's a need that the atheists say, hey, we better start our propaganda machine, because there's a growing sense that we may be losing the philosophical battle in America. But let me just give you some reasons. I think one of the reasons people struggle with the belief in God is it seems anti-intellectual. That a belief in God is for people who really haven't thought deeply. People who've never considered the scientific, quote-unquote, ideas. People who have never thought philosophically. If they really did, they would understand, you cannot believe in an ultimate absolute deity, some God somewhere. Carl Sagan wrote, "As science advances, there seems to be less and less for God to do." Now, he was reflecting exactly what Friedrich Nietzsche said when he said, "We have killed God, we have killed the need for God because we have all the answers now." Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett said, "We don't want to be known as atheists. We want to be known as the Brights." That's right, the Brights. In other words, we don't believe in ghosts, elves, the Easter Bunny, or God. They are smart people, and said, we are smart people who do not fall for silly superstitions. You go, wow, so I must be dumb if I believe in God. I must not have any intellectual capabilities or capacity to believe in God. So some people think, it's anti-intellectual to believe in a deity. There's another reason people struggle with the belief in God, and this one is a struggle that all of us at one time or another have had to wrestle with, and that's the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, the problem of pain, the problem of evil, the problem of our personal pain. Why did my mother die when I was young? Why did my son get AIDS? Why did I lose my job? Why was my child killed in the accident? You can go on and on and on. And those are tough questions, because we say, wait a minute, if there is a God and He is this loving God as you say, and if this God also is almighty powerful, so if He's love and all-powerful, that means why didn't He stop all this bad stuff? Why do wars exist? Why does famine exist? Why do babies die by the thousands in Africa from famine and AIDS? Why? And those are valid questions. And there have been a lot of books written on the topic, and we're going to talk about that issue in a couple of sessions upcoming. But that is one reason people struggle with the existence of God, because of evil. Another reason people struggle is religious pluralism and the question of truth. By religious pluralism, the idea is, look, we don't need to say only one religious or philosophical group has all the right answers. And there really is no such thing as absolute truth. That's kind of what some people call the postmodern philosophy. Everything is relative, nothing is absolute. And we have too much religious confusion now. This one says they're right. This one says their way is right. You Christians say you're the only way. The Buddhists say this. The Muslims say this, and all of these kind of things. So there's religious confusion. And after all, isn't truth a cultural or sociological construct? In other words, the reason you believe there's a God, Mike Chapman, and the reason you believe that God is the God of the Bible, Jesus Christ, is because you grew up in the conservative southeast portion of the United States, where that is the predominant worldview. Of course you would believe that. But someone else who grew up in another part of the world, they have a different worldview. And they have a different view of truth. And your truth is no better than their truth, or vice versa. And so what they say is the reason you have a Christian worldview is because of your culture and your upbringing, because you're an American. But if you were Indian, you'd probably be Hindu, or Sikh, or Jainism. Or if you were from Thailand, you'd be Buddhist. Or if you're from Israel, you'd be Jewish. Or if you were from Saudi Arabia, you would be Muslim. And or if you were from some small tribal group in some remote jungle somewhere, you might worship fire. But you can't claim that your worldview is the only one right. It's just a worldview coming from a cultural, sociological seedbed, and it's grown. Boy, that's a tough one. And that's another reason people struggle with the idea of absolute truths. People struggle with the idea of philosophical truth. And that's a tough one. Another one is what I call a personal bias against religion. Maybe people have had a bad experience with religion. And I promise you, you can have a bad experience with religion. But you can have a bad experience at work, a bad experience at school, a bad experience in your neighborhood, a bad experience in your family. Bad experiences are everywhere. So it's not just in religion. It just happens because we hang with people, and people are people, and I am people, and you are people, and stuff happens. But they've had a bad experience. And there's this bias against religion. And it seems like even in America there's a growing bias against religion as we see this cultural shift occurring, this tipping point of more relativism and tolerance. And the bottom line is religion and people of faith are more and more finding themselves marginalized in culture. Dr. Steven Weinberg, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, said this: "Anything that we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in the end be our greatest contribution to civilization. The world needs to wake up from its long nightmare of religious belief." That was in the New York Times, 2006. He said, the best contribution we scientists can make is to lessen the impact of religion. Did that sound like a bias against religion? Philosopher Thomas Nagel said, "I want atheism to be true. It isn't that I just don't believe in God. I don't want to believe in God. I don't want a universe that is like that." Does that sound like you're biased? Isaac Asimov, a scientist and a science fiction writer, made this statement: "Emotionally, I am an atheist. I don't have the evidence to prove that God doesn't exist, but I so strongly suspect that He doesn't that I don't want to waste my time trying to find out." Does that sound like a kind of a prejudice? I mean, this man is supposed to be a scientist. A scientist, by his very nature, is a person who is in the pursuit of truth. He says, emotionally, I don't want to believe in God. I don't want to take the time to find out. He said, I'm not going to pursue it because I just believe it'd be a waste of time. In other words, again, there's this bias against religion. There's this bias against theism. And we've had a number of books that have come out in recently. Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Sam Harris, The End of Faith. Victor Stinger, The Failed Hypothesis. Michael Onfray, The Atheist Manifesto, which he said was the last battle against the forces of Christianity. So, why don't people believe in God? Well, only stupid people believe in God. Or, we don't believe in God because if there was a God, why is there so much evil? Or, no one has a market on truth, and your truth is just something you have culturally, it's been wrapped in the fabric of the culture from which you came, and that's why you believe it's true. Or the bottom line is, we just don't like religion. We don't like the idea of God at all. In the middle of that, you find a small sentence of a verse that is repeated several times in the Psalms. One of those places is Psalm chapter 14, verse 1. It says, "The fool says in his heart, God does not exist." So I guess we could kind of say what the psalmist thought about that. He said, the fool says in his heart, God does not exist. I guess we've all had our doubts. I had doubts once upon a time. And I struggled with doubts when I was in college, even though I was a Christian. And I was in a Christian university, but I was beginning to struggle whether I believed it or not. And I'll tell you a little bit later how I worked through that. So let's talk about truth. What is truth? Jesus in John chapter 18, verses 37 through 8, was having a conversation with Pilate during his trial before his crucifixion. And Jesus said to Pilate, "All who love the truth recognize what I say is true." Then Pilate looked at him and said, "What is truth?" What is truth? And that's a fundamental question that we have to ask. What is truth? And I ask each one of you, what is truth? If I were to say to you, truth is, and you had to finish that sentence, how would you complete it? Truth is what? I heard one man say, truth is the facts. Well, that may be a simple definition. Another person said, truth is what is. I said, that's good. But let me help you understand kind of more philosophically how you would define truth. And those two things really fit into the philosophical definition. But truth is that which corresponds to reality. Reality is what is. Reality is reality. It is. Now the question is, if God is real, then He's part of that reality. In fact, I would say God is the source of all reality and the ultimate reality, but reality. So truth is what corresponds to reality. Truth is a statement, a hypothesis, a proposition that correctly reflects what is. You see what I'm saying? So the question is, if I say there is a God, the only way that can be true if it is an accurate reflection of the fact that God exists. And the same thing would be true if I say there is no God. The only way that's true if in fact there is no God. That in reality there is no God. Mortimer Adler defined truth this way. The definition of truth is the agreement of thought with reality. What makes a descriptive proposition true is that it corresponds to the way things really are. That would be like me taking you and we would go to the top of the Empire State Building and I would say, you know what? I have learned to fly. I can jump off this building and fly. Now, that would mean one of two things. Either I was totally deluded or I was an absolute insane liar, and those two things would really go together. Because, and I don't care how much I would stand there and sing the song, I believe I can fly, spread my wings and fly away. And if I jumped off, I would discover that when I said I could fly was not true. Truth is what corresponds to reality. Now, with that understanding, let's take this a step further. There's a difference between knowing and believing. Knowing and believing. How can I know truth? Knowing relies exclusively on observation and experience. To know something is true, I have to have observed it or experienced it. I know ice is cold. Fire is hot. Water is wet. I know that. I have experienced it. I've touched fire, it is hot. I've touched ice, it is cold. I have touched water, it is wet. I could say I know that a caterpillar is woolly caterpillar. I know that. I've experienced that. So whatever I have experienced or observed, and if my observation is correct and was correct, then I can say I know that. Believing is different. Believing relies on observation and experience, but it also adds other elements of common sense and human reason. For instance, a jury sits and listens to evidence. They were not there when the crime occurred. They didn't see it, feel it, hear it, observe it, nothing. They were not there. But witnesses and attorneys are attempting to get them to come to believe a certain thing is true. They can't know it's true because they did not experience it. But they can come to a point that they believe it's true or not true based on what they have seen. They believe it. The moment you and I take observation, and when it comes to this idea of God and truth, the moment you and I take observation and evidence and begin to place a value judgment on it, then I'm moving beyond simply knowing to believing. Believing is when you place a value on what you have seen and what you have observed. There's a lot more you and I believe to be true than what we know to be true. I believe there was a civil war. I have never experienced the Civil War in America. I have never experienced the gunpowder. I've never heard the shots. I've never seen boys and soldiers in blue and gray clash. I was not there. It happened before my time. But I believe there was a civil war. I believe that. And I believe that that is an accurate reflection of reality. I believe more than I know because I didn't experience the war. I didn't observe the war. I believe more than I know. And that's an important point I want everybody to understand. All of us believe more than we know. Because belief is a combination of knowledge and reason and common sense and the heart and the gut. It's all of those things. In fact, belief is actually deeper than knowing because it involves more human faculties than simply knowing. Knowing means I experience it. Belief means I have looked at things and I have looked and I've observed and I've analyzed, and then I have my head, my heart, and my guts all going together. I believe this. Belief actually involves more than just knowing. Now, they're not contrary. Knowing something involves your senses. Belief is not necessarily in opposition to your senses, but is a different way of looking at truth. So if someone says, I do not believe there's a God, I believe truth is there is no God, they really don't know that. They're basically saying, this is what I've come to believe. And when I say, I believe there is a God, well, as a Christian, I do know part of that because I've had an experience with God. You say, oh, no, you haven't. Well, let me tell you, I have had an experience with God that in my understanding was real. But let's give the person the benefit of the doubt. Okay, but I believe there's a God. Because in my process of thinking about the truth, there is a God, in my value evaluation of that, I now believe it. Now, let's take that a little further and see how that plays out. To believe something is to look at the evidence, make use of our reason, listen to our heart, and come to a rational and satisfying conclusion that you can live with. When I was in college, I went to a Christian university from a traditional Christian family. I went there and I was in the theology and Bible and theology track. I was on the track to be a pastor. That's what I felt I was going to do. But it was really amazing during my first year. I began to doubt everything. I began to doubt what I was hearing. I began to doubt what I was thinking. And I was wondering, is this really true, or do we just want to kind of want to believe it so hard we just believe it? So in other words, I came back, I was postmodern and didn't realize it. Is this just because I was raised this way I believe this? And I remember I went on a journey. I didn't say it out loud to anyone because my word, at that time people would have flipped out if I said, I don't know if I really, how do you know the Bible was really a book from God? How do you know Jesus really lived? Did he really die? There's all these stories that we hear. And so I began to look. I remember picking up C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, and was greatly impacted by that book and the journey of his own journey from atheism to faith. I remember looking at other sources and looking at things, and in that process I came to see that there is some really strong evidence for God. To me, the evidence for the existence of God is more strong than the evidence against the existence of God. Because I believe God has left a testimony. I believe there's a testimony for God. And after about 6 months to a year, I finally came to be at peace. I came to be at peace there is a God. I came to be at peace that I believe that. So how did we go there? And how do I encourage people to go there? Is there a testimony for God? I believe, first of all, there's the testimony of curiosity. Where does our interest in and our longing for God come from? Why is it that the idea of God, the interest in God, the longing for God, the longing for the transcendent is so cross-cultural and so time, goes across all time, that there are men from all different backgrounds have this longing to know a God? Why? Can you just say it's all cultural? I think it goes deeper than that. The book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 1 says, God has planted eternity in the human heart. There is something in the human heart, there's something in the human life that reaches out and just instinctively knows there's something beyond. There's more to the world than the material energy philosophy. Now you say, well, the atheists, well, they don't believe that. You know what's interesting? I actually believe the idea that there's a God, the idea that there's something more, is a first truth. A first truth in philosophy is something that's fundamental. You were not taught it. No one instructed you in it. You just know it. Self-existence is a first truth. No one has to be taught. No baby has to be taught that they exist. We know we exist. It's a first truth. You just know. Sight is something you don't have to be taught. Now, you may have to later be taught how sight works, that you have eyes. A baby doesn't know it has eyes, but it knows it has sight. But it knows it has sight because it's just fundamental. It's fundamental to human existence. And the question is the belief in the transcendent, is the belief in God something that is a first truth? I believe no one's ever born an atheist or an agnostic. I don't believe that. I don't believe anyone is ever born with a blank slate and then people fill it in. You know why? Most of the time if you meet an atheist or an agnostic and you begin to have a conversation with them and you say something like this, have you always been an atheist? Have you always been an agnostic? Usually you hear a person say, no, not always, but I begin to transition to this at a certain point. There was a point that they rejected it. Now here's the deal. A first truth can be rejected. A first truth can be no longer believed. But in the very act of rejecting it, you are admitting that you once believed it. And there are people who have come from cultural environments where there was no sense of religion. They've come from non-religious families, but they came to a point that they said, I came to a point that I no longer believe that there was a God. It's interesting. Their very rejection of deity is a confirmation that somewhere they once believed it. Cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker even went this far, and he's an atheist. He said, there is a God module in the brain that predisposes people to believe in God. He said, there's just something in the brain. People just have this predisposition to believe in God. And we've just got to tell them, that's just something you have and it's not true. Well, could it be what the writer of Ecclesiastes said? God has placed eternity in our heart. We've all stood on a beach and looked at the stars or looked at the horizon and stood in amazement on a beautiful night and looked at the billions of stars in the Milky Way, which if you counted them all at 1 second at a time, it would take you 2,500 years to count just the stars in the Milky Way. That's how many there are. And you say, wow, wow, wow. It's amazing. Stephen Jay Gould, paleontologist and evolutionist, said this: we are here because one odd group of fishes had a peculiar fin of anatomy that could transform into legs for terrestrial creatures because the earth never froze entirely during the Ice Age. Because a small, tenuous species rising in Africa 250,000 years ago has managed so far to survive by hook and by crook. We may yearn for a higher answer, but none exists. This explanation, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating and exhilarating. Do you feel liberated and exhilarated by that? Hey, it's some fish that somehow their fins became legs and they crawled out, and somewhere about 2 million years ago, a strange group of species known as Homo sapiens kind of crawled out of the muck and mire. He said it may seem superficially troubling, but it's really liberating. Well, I feel liberated. Interesting. But then we have another great philosopher, Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt said it this way: if you ask me, I say, toss this whole American dream. We have to find something else. I tell you, I am sitting on all that success, personal gain, and I am telling you it's not what you think it is. I'm the guy who has everything. I'm telling you that once you have everything and then you are left with yourself, it doesn't help you to sleep any better, and you don't wake up better because of it. What is he saying? There's got to be something more than this. He didn't feel liberated by evolution or by the amassing of wealth. There's got to be something more. So there is the testimony of curiosity. People long for the transcendent. Where did that come from? Can you hunger for something that doesn't exist, or does that have to exist and it creates the hunger? I believe the second is correct. Here's a second testimony of God. The testimony of the universe. How and why does the universe exist as it does? Jean Paul Sartre said, the greatest philosophical question is this: why is there something rather than nothing? We know the universe exists. The question is, why? What do I believe about where it came from? Psalm 19 says, the heavens are telling the glory of God. Romans 1:19 and 20 says, people try to put a shroud over the truth, but the basic reality of God is plain enough. Open your eyes and there it is. By taking a long and thoughtful look at what God has created, people have always been able to see with their eyes as much as they can't see what their eyes as such can't see. Eternal power. For instance, the mystery of His divine being, so no one has an excuse. I want you to understand something. Even scientists agree with this. The universe does not contain within it an explanation for its own existence. It's called the law of causality. It's the law of cause and effect. Every effect has to have a cause, and no effect is greater than its cause. The predominant theory of how it all came was an explosion called the Big Bang, and all of matter and energy exploded out of a microscopic bundle of matter and energy, and in a matter of moments everything came out of that. And here's what evolutionists will tell you. The Big Bang did not evolve. It just happened. So the Big Bang is where everything is reduced to a singularity. And if that's true, then the law of science, the law of physics breaks down. A singularity is something that happens only once and has no known cause for it to occur. If that is the fact, then the law of physics and any other scientific law breaks down at that point. You do not know why. That's interesting. Therefore, the starting point then must not be natural. One of the reasons the theory of evolution even exists, it is to take natural science to discover and to study singularities, which every scientist knows is an impossibility because it cannot be tested, it cannot be observable through repeatable testing. It is impossible. So when you're talking about the origin of the universe, guess what you do? You have reached something that is not natural. In other words, if I said, well, if we traced everything back, say, okay, well, this caused this, and this caused this, and this caused this, because every effect has to have a cause, and this caused this, and this caused this, you've got to eventually reach something that caused everything after it, but had no cause in and of itself. And that is called the uncaused cause. And it is philosophically impossible to have an endless succession of cause and effect. It cannot happen. So what do? You get to a point that you have an uncaused cause. Now, when you get to that point, you have crossed a line. You have crossed a line between the normal operation of life to a singularity, to something that is outside the natural understanding of things. And what do we call that? We call it supernatural. That's what we call it. That which is above and outside the natural is supernatural. And we also know that everything infinite has to have a cause. It has to have a beginning. So if it doesn't have a beginning and have no cause, then, wait a minute, I think I said that wrong. Everything over here is finite. I said it wrong. Let me get it right. Everything over here that has a cause is finite, but if you're over here with no cause, it must be infinite. Infinite means without beginning, and ultimately without end. Has no limits. So if the uncaused cause, which must exist philosophically and scientifically, is supernatural and infinite by definition, you've just described God. God is supernatural and infinite. Science has actually defined God the way theologians define God. That was one of those big wake-up calls to me when I was going through my own time of doubt. Francis Collins, once a stern atheist, who's now the president or the director of the National Institutes of Health, who was on the team that actually discovered and unraveled DNA. From that research in the genome, at the Center for Human Genome Research, and he realized there are 3.1 billion bits of information in the DNA, in every person's DNA. From that, he said, this is impossible to have randomly happened. Because what you have is what is known as a specified complexity. A specified complexity is a number of elements. It means it's complex, but they all work together for a common purpose. Science has always said, the law of forensic science says, anywhere you see specified complexity, intelligence has to be behind it. It's causing something to take a shape or form or function that it could never take on its own. This is a specified complexity. And there's a third law of science, the law of uniformity. Whatever causes some effect in the past will cause that same effect in the future. So, if intelligence is the cause for all specified complexity, and science says that, if you believe that the human body is a specified complexity, if you believe that this planet is a specified complexity, if you believe that the Milky Way, yes, and the entire universe is a specified complexity, meaning multiple parts, but all having a specific function that mutually supports the whole. If that's the case, and I don't know how you could argue it any other way, it has to have intelligent intervention. Someone asked one time, do you believe that scientists one day may be able to create spontaneous life in a laboratory? And I said, I have no idea. I kind of doubt it, but let's say they were able. Let's say they were able to create a one-celled amoeba-like life, and they can do that. What would that say? I said it confirms this. That could have never happened without the massive intervention of scientists and intellectual intervention. In other words, specified complexity cannot occur without intelligent intervention. So what it says, the cause, the uncaused cause, has to be supernatural. It has to be outside the natural world, thereby not capable of even being studied by natural science, because natural science cannot study singularities. 2, it says that it is a supernatural, it is infinite because it has no beginning, and the law of uniformity says it's intelligent, because what's behind it is a specified complexity. Francis Collins became a Christian as a result of his study of DNA. Shocked the scientific world. Today he is an outspoken Christian. And in his book, The Language of God, a scientist presents evidence for belief. Because he said the cause has to be intelligent. Considered one of the great scientists of our day, a medical doctor scientist. He's a committed Christian. And he didn't get it by listening to an evangelist preach. He studied DNA. And he said, you cannot deny there is a God. Isn't that interesting? So you have the testimony of the universe, the testimony of curiosity, the testimony of conscience. What is the source of man's sense of right and wrong? Why is it there is a moral code woven into the fabric of every human being that lives? Romans chapter 2 verse 15 says this, God's law is not something alien imposed on us from without, but woven into the very fabric of our creation. There is something deep within that echoes God's yes and God's no, God's right and God's wrong. We have moral concepts of right and wrong. We have concepts of ought and ought not, should and should not. We cannot avoid this way of thinking and cannot avoid this way of acting. No human can avoid it. If we're walking down a riverbank and we hear someone yelling, help me, I'm drowning, there's an instant reaction inside of us that says, somebody's got to do something. Do I call 911? Do I jump in? Why did you feel that? Why did you feel that? Why did you? I got to do something. And if you don't do something, you feel guilty because you didn't. Where did that come from? Say, well, that's just what we've been taught. All over the world, same people have same moral codes. They've never read the Ten Commandments, never heard the Bible. Why do they have these moral codes? And we know we have moral choices. People know we have moral choices. That we have the freedom to choose. Our whole vocabulary of blame and affirmation comes from the sense of a moral code. There is a conscience. And then the testimony of my own life. Why do I believe in God? To be honest with you, I still have questions I can't answer. But I've come to the point that I believe the truth, that there is a God. And I'm like a lot of Christians. I'm like a man in the Bible in Mark chapter 9, where Jesus talked to him and asked him, did he believe? He said, I believe, help me with my doubts. I'm like that as well. The Bible invites us to taste and see if the Lord is good. When I made a decision after looking at all these things, that I had to believe there was a God, and I didn't believe that that God had revealed himself in Jesus Christ, because I realized there's no other book in the world like the Bible, not one. That I found that my longing for security and my longing for significance had been met, and my hunger for the transcendent, believing that there's something more than just what meets the eye. And I was satisfied with the rationality of it. And it felt right to me. My gut said, when I asked the question, what is truth? And I looked at it, I said, my gut said, this is truth. And I found it in Jesus. And I discovered something that made my heart shout, I am alive. I'm alive. There's a purpose. C.S. Lewis said it this way. If I find in myself a desire for which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. I remember when I read that quote for the first time, it was during that time of my doubt. And it stopped me dead in my tracks, because I knew there were things in my life that were not satisfying. Do I have all the answers? No. Can I answer every question that you may have about God? I am sure I cannot. Do I fully understand all the ways of God and how God operates? And when I ask that question, I want to say, you got to be kidding. I don't want a God that I can fully understand. That means He's no bigger than my thoughts. He's no bigger than my puny rationale. I want a God bigger than that. A God that has mystery. A God that you go, oh, wow, God. Wow. That's the God I want to know. So why should you believe in God? Look for His fingerprints. They're everywhere.